The biggest difference that I found talking to someone who was a native speaker of Spanish versus me in the classroom was I had to force myself to learn or remember all the information that I had learned and use it towards that conversation. While in a regular in-person Spanish class, I felt like I wasn't given the chance to go based off what I've already learned, because someone's always right there to correct you or right there to be like, okay, like if you're not prepared, you don't have to. But I felt more confident on Talk Abroad than I did in an in-person class, just because it was more personalized. When you're in the classroom, you have, maybe 20 other people looking at you, trying to listen to the conversation that you're speaking with another person. Well, in Talk Abroad, it's just you and your partner, and you're able to work through it together, and you don't have commentary coming from everybody else or someone trying to jump into the conversation real quick and try and save you before you say something.
Yeah, I've had like similar experiences to Cassidy where like I didn't know exactly like how to phrase my ideas. So I'd say what I could. And then it was really nice because the person I would be on the call with, my conversation partner, they would come in and they would like rephrase it to be like more actually consistent with the grammar of the language. And for me, I've done Talk Abroad calls in French and Spanish, and both times, like, the people I was talking to were able to like figure out what I was saying and sort of like rephrase it back to me in a way that was like grammatically accurate, or if I was like substituting a word that wasn't quite the word that a native speaker would use, they could come in and like correct me. It's nice to like be in a lower stress environment where like, I mean, my teachers will correct me too if I'm like coming into office hours, or if it's like actually gonna mess up the flow of the conversation if I make a mistake. But like in Talk Abroad, it's even, lower pressure. So you can really just like figure out how to express yourself, because like your conversation partner is trying to help you work around your mistakes and figure out like what you're saying, so you can just like chat.
And also during one of my last conversations, I really enjoyed it because I had more, like at that point I had the most vocab and sentence structures, and we were able to talk about like the health systems in America versus the health systems in Costa Rica. And she was actually telling me about how like it's very cheap and like the wait times aren't very long, and I was able to like research it afterwards and learn more about it, and I thought it was actually very interesting.
Well, welcome and thanks for joining us for this last of our workshop series. This workshop is really focusing on assessment of Talk Abroad conversations in the curriculum. I'm Todd, I'm the president of Talk Abroad. I've got Daniel here from Michigan State with me. Daniel, you want to give a quick intro for the 7th time?
Sure. This is your first one. Welcome. This
You're in
is
the wrong place.
one.
First one.
Yeah. All right. So very first one, Daniel Trago. I'm at Michigan State University. Taught Spanish for many years, and now I work in curriculum development and digital media production. I have been working with Todd and Talk Abroad for almost a decade, and it's been a great journey. And we're going to end today talking about assessment, which is kind of I think fitting, right? That final thing that we get to is, what do we do with all this in the end when we know we've got to, within our given context, we have to evaluate students. So how do we do that?
Yeah.
Kyle, take it away.
Yeah. Well, let me provide a little bit of context. We kind of joked about if this being your first person, you don't know who Daniel is, then you're in the wrong place. But really, this is the final one focusing on assessment. If you're interested in learning about the different types of impact that Talk Abroad can make in your curriculum, some of those outcomes, there are 4 prior videos that are focused on different themes about curriculum implementation. The last 2, number 5 and number 6, have been focused on implementing Talk Abroad in the 100 level curriculum, and a separate one on the 200 level curriculum. So those are all available to you right now. If you've missed them, they'll be on our YouTube channel from here on. And we would suggest, if you're not particularly interested in about how to assess, that you go back and look at some of those and then maybe end here. Daniel, maybe we can start off or by giving a quick summary of where we've gotten to in this point, just so that we're starting at the same foundation. We've kind of discussed in both 100 level and 200 level that when you're implementing Talk Abroad, you need to keep a keen eye to what the purpose of your curriculum is and how Talk Abroad conversations fit into that purpose. In that way, your students really know why they're doing these conversations. Why am I sitting and talking with a native speaker? What am I supposed to be learning? Plugging that into the context is important. Once you fit it into the curriculum with the purpose, then each of the conversations is generally structured in 3 parts. We have a preparation activity where the student's experience is being scaffolded, and that's important both at the 100 level, 200 level, and even up in the upper level, 300 level content courses. Once you've prepared the student, then they have their conversation, 15-minute conversation or 30-minute conversation. And we said you can really do any number at the 100 level. Usually 1 to 3 15-minute conversations works great. At the 200 level, 4 to 6 conversations is about average. Once they've had the conversation, then students will have some sort of reflection activity where they're taking a look at what happened, how it went, what they learned, maybe planning for the next conversation that they're doing, giving themselves some feedback, but really just processing what happened. And that's kind of the standard Talk Abroad implementation across most of the schools that are successfully implemented. That's where we're at right now. That's what we've kind of established in our previous ones. Now we're to this point of talking about, in an educational context, some assessment has to be done.
We've talked so much about setting goals and the why behind implementing Talk Abroad, or the why behind implementing anything in your curriculum. An assessment, and the way I see it, is we need to test to see if we reach those goals, right? So when I think about testing for my students and assessment, it's, hey, we've set these goals, and assessment is to see if you've reached that goal. It's a way to measure your progress towards that goal. And I think that's a really good kind of working definition that we use as we talk about assessment here. So we want to see, like, yeah, all right, before we didn't use Talk Abroad and now we do, like, was it effective? Was it helpful? What can it do? Does it help our students achieve these goals? Like, how can we measure that? So I think one of the things that we did is, because we have a lot of students in the classes and instructors generally have, 75 to 100 students in a given semester, and we were implementing 5 half-an-hour conversations throughout the semester. There's just no way to listen to all that.
Yep.
So one of the things that we did, and we actually kind of tied this in, this is kind of cool, tied it in with the reflection piece. So in the 100 and 200 level workshops, we talked a lot about the reflection after the conversation and a little bit of the process and what we had students do. And so we had them transcribe I think we call it like the most interesting part of the conversation, but it's really the relevant part of the conversation to our topic or what we're trying to find. And so what we did is we had the students transcribe just a portion. I think we had a word limit. You could have a time limit. But then what we did is we had the students indicate using like a timestamp. So like, oh, I'm going to transcribe, 2 minutes of my conversation, and I'm starting at minute 11. Like you said, Todd, like, ooh, that's where I shined. That's where we got to the meat of things. This is what I learned. And then I transcribed 2 minutes. And then so what we did for instructors was said, hey, all you have to do is open that transcription. You see the timestamp, so you can open their audio and really focus on the part that the student is choosing to kind of present to you as a teacher. So then I can go through and listen to, 2 to 3 minutes of all of the conversations and be able to give feedback that's relevant. And it just really created a lot an easier workflow, but I would also argue that it might even be a more productive workflow too.
And what was the content of the feedback that you were aiming to give? How did that relate to your stated outcomes?
Yeah, so in our stated outcomes, we had a proficiency goal. So we were not assessing a particular grammatical feature for each student. There might have been like a holistic thing that we were kind of looking at, but basically we were looking for content and communication of ideas and meaning. And so we've talked also in the other workshops that it's really important that you don't just the the culmination of all the preparation isn't the conversation. It's actually the reflection and the sharing of what happened during the conversation. And so what we would look at is, hey, were you able to communicate the ideas that you were trying to communicate? Were they understood? Were they interpreted on the part of the conversation partner? So we were looking at it in a much more holistic sense in terms of actually assessing the conversation itself. So our assessment actually came more in like, how well was the transcription done? Was it accurate? Does it show that you understand the meaning and the context? And then they would give presentations and sometimes write little reflective essays. So we were grading more based on the meaning and based on what the takeaway from the conversations were.
So your goal is to have them engage with a native speaker, have real communication happen, and then assess their reflection and what they're taking away from that experience more than the actual minutes that they spent during the conversation speaking.
But there are some people who are looking at certain grammatical features, who are looking a little bit more intently into those structures. And that's possible. I think you have to, that's really hard with a like really black and white strict rubric, just because it's not a completely controlled environment. So like I might be having a student narrate something in the past, and then like their goal is to get this idea across or talk with a speaker about this, but somehow it like changes a little bit. And like, ooh, what if I don't really get the features that I was looking for, but meaning was still communicated? So like, do you try to force like these formulaic things, or do you let it be more natural? I would argue that because it's a actual speaker, that this context is much better suited towards that natural conversation. Again, the TalkAbroad partners are not language teachers, and maybe even more accurate to say language assessment experts, right? Who perfectly align with whatever class the student comes from. So it's harder. It's not to say you can't do it, but I think you have to be able to take a step back and realize that context, what that looks like.
Yeah, it is important in assessment. It's important to know what's possible and what's not possible and what you're working with. And in some ways, you know, a TalkAbroad experience will be a different experience compared to a, you know, let's pull the student out of class and have a one-on-one with the teacher where I can assess their replies to a dialogue, right? Because then everything can be controlled, everything can be done the same, and we can see how they do. TalkAbroad is a variation on that, right? You're going to get a similar experience with opportunities for output and you know, hearing and things like that. But it's with a person that's a real person that's not programmed according to certain questions. And so if you're aiming to practice the preterite, it's possible that the conversation partner speaks a little bit differently in their local area, and maybe they don't use the kind of the standard speaking ways, and so some of those assignments will be different for different students. And that's something to kind of plan around, right? And it does kind of bring to the forefront some of this, some of the patterns around assessment that we've seen from different professors. And one of those is what you're describing here, basically not grading the actual conversation strictly, but really focusing on both the pre-work, the preparation, and the reflection afterwards. So grading heavily the preparation, if you're focusing on a grammar touch, right? Planning 4 questions that all use the imperfect and being ready to ask them, or they all use the preterite, or they all use the subjunctive. And then making sure that the student uses that during the conversation and afterwards is able to transcribe what the response was. What did the partner say when I asked them what they would do if they had $1 million? And so they're still engaging in that grammar area that they're wanting, but they're not grading explicitly what's said according to a rubric during the conversation. They're looking at what the results were afterwards, they're looking at the preparation beforehand, and using that as a way to make sure that the student is going in the right direction.
Yeah, and especially with the post assignments too, like with presentations or essays, like I'm then again as the instructor have a little bit more control, and then we can actually formulate some of the things. So they talk about what they learned with their conversation partner, and then we can focus on some of those features. Or I might globally listen to all 20 of my conversations and be like, guys, I noticed this is happening kind of broadly across the class. Maybe we should look at that. Or maybe just I internalize that as a teacher and realize, oh, there's some gaps that we need to address collectively. Yeah.
And bringing that back into class.
Yeah, and I mean, the research on feedback is very interesting too. And I won't stake my claim on one side or the other, but I tend to question how effective delayed feedback is. And so like you have a conversation and then it's recorded and then you hear it and then a professor gives you some sort of correction or something. Like if that doesn't affect meaning and it wasn't in real time, like we're not 100% sure that feedback is internalized the same way where something's happening in real time and like the message is misconstrued. Like there's something going on there, and
frown and scrunch their eyes up, and that's the feedback that impacts you to try and rephrase it or things like that.
Yeah, and again, there's a lot of research out there, and we're still trying to figure that out. But I would argue that the feedback is almost too delayed to be very specific. Maybe if like this is the thing that's nice about listening, like if you could listen to the conversation with your student and kind of pick apart things like, okay, you did this right here. It's super highly contextualized. It's not just me like saying, oh, this was wrong here, take this back. Like we're talking about this together and you're able, that I think you could maybe elicit more in this. It's a great affordance. It's almost like delayed, but still in the moment, right? Because you have that recording. So there are ways to look at it. Again, I think it's just how you use the tools and knowing the affordances that it has, you know, and some of the.
Yep. Let's briefly talk about strategies for using rubrics in this, because rubrics are so standard, and it seems like most or many TalkAbroad users will use some sort of rubric to communicate to students what's required or what they're being graded on. And I think the challenge here is that it varies depending on what the purpose is, right? So there are some rubrics that really are looking for, are you able to use certain grammar during the conversation? And there are others that are focusing on, are you prepared? Are you motivated? You know, that type of thing. But do you have any insight onto what types or how to think about using a rubric with the grading of a TalkAbroad conversation?
Yeah, I think the rubrics are good because they help just kind of make everything clear, right? Especially in terms of like student equity. Like if I give one student this grade and then another student a different grade, like is that arbitrary or is it like I can point to that? And so rubrics are really necessary for that. I think this goes back to our very first conversation where it's like, what is the stated outcome? So if your stated outcome at the end of a class is, hey, my students will be able to communicate very well in the past tense, then I would actually design my rubrics during the talk abroad conversations to reflect that final goal. And again, depending on how, like, I think this is where we need to bring in some assessment terminology where we look at the difference between like a formative assessment and a summative assessment. So I like talk abroad as kind of this formative assessment where, like, yeah, we're checking to see how, if you can use some of these concepts and forms that we've been talking about, but at the same time you're still learning and there are novel things happening and you're moving forward instead of just saying like, okay, we've spent all semester on this and then I'm going to give you a talk abroad and depending on how well you do in this area, that's your grade, right? It's not just this performance thing that shows me what you've done. It's also like some of the proficiency, like not what have I memorized, but what can I do? And so there might be something novel that comes up. So I guess my advice is if you have a rubric that's very standardized, there's some good things about that. But I like that category to just like, it's almost like the X factor and talk about because it can happen like, oh, my conversation went a completely different way and I was able to navigate it.
Yeah.
Like for me, like I want to like celebrate that. Sure, like yeah, we're going to try to prepare them and help them and scaffold these things in a way that they can be successful. And you can fill out like, I was able to talk in the past tense. I was like, again, like it's a conversation. So like, do you just only evaluate what the student said apart from what the conversation partner gives? And I think maybe that might be one of like the pushbacks I give sometimes when I see some of the rubrics is they're very centered on the student performance, which is fine. But then my thought is, well, why do you need a conversation partner? Is it just to fill space?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm always looking at how that interaction goes back and forth and you navigate it.
This is one of those rabbit holes or those challenges in implementing something like talk abroad because it can be done in both ways. You know, it can be summative at the end. We're going to do we're going to build up to a conversation and then we're going to go and do it. We're going to get a grade and we're going to practice in class before. And that can be effective as long as it's contextualized and implemented really well. Alternatively, something like you're describing, which is not a let's wait until the end, it's a let's use this in the learning process and we'll be reflecting, we'll be practicing, we'll be doing all this. And these experiences are a journey to get to a place where we can use the language. And different programs are set up in different ways and different professors have different flexibility or constraints that they're working in, right? Some have to use a certain type of textbook or a certain type of evaluation and assessment at the end. And it's got to be kind of wrangled into that format, which is fine and certainly can be done. And we'd like to, one of the goals here in this conversation is to point professors to some different resources that we do have. And this might be a good time to mention on one of our big goals moving forward, and you should be seeing these right on our YouTube channel as well as right through the professor dashboard if you've created a dashboard, is a big series of professors who are sharing their content, what they're doing, what they're teaching, how they're using talk abroad in that, and how they're assessing. And so if this kind of more broad, open-ended conversation that we're having is intriguing and you want to dig a little bit more into your context, that's a really good place to dive into because it's a little bit more specific rather than general. Secondly, we do have both a mentoring program where those professors who you've seen in our video series here are willing to actually meet and discuss some of these things. So if that's of interest to you, get in contact with us. There's a form where you can request some mentoring from a professor. And then also we have an area where we provide some curriculum consulting with a curriculum specialist like Daniel, where we can actually dive into what is your curriculum, what are the goals in your specific context and what you're trying to do and the constraints that you have, what type of assessment would make sense for what you're trying to do. And it's a challenge because every program is so different. And so if you want some resources to kind of help navigate that, we're available. All of that is complimentary, and you just need to get in touch with our sales staff, and we'll be able to kind of work through that. I think maybe Daniel, jumping in and seeing a little video from a professor here with some of the pitfalls and the successes that she had might be a good kind of transition where we can just point out a couple of things to remember before wrapping up after this bigger discussion.
Yeah, I think that's great. As academics, we usually only share what works and not what doesn't work. So,
so when I presented at AATF, these were my assessment pitfalls and triumphs, right? And so you need to assign grades for the right components, which is where I came up with this idea of just giving them full credit, because grading them on accuracy here was terrible. It increases their anxiety and also the amount of time that I have to spend on grading those things. At one point I was like, okay, I'm going to have them do the talk abroad, but I'm not going to grade anything for that. I'm only going to grade their reflection, which doesn't give any value to the anxiety and the time put into the actual conversation, right? So I have to assign, I thought I was reducing the anxiety by doing that, but sometimes the reflection papers weren't deep enough, and I was grading those pretty critically, right? So then their talk abroad felt valueless as far as their grade was concerned. So there needed to be some kind of grade put in the grade book associated with the talk abroad experience. So that was a pitfall that I learned along the way. So I do a complete conversation, they get a grade for that, but it's, pass, fail, yes or no. And then the follow-up conversation, is what is assessed. Yeah, give them, and don't have it tied to, correctness. I also, again, like no assessment, no discussion of what kind of learning they were having. If you're not going to take data afterwards, if you're not going to have a classroom conversation about that, it's just going to reinforce stereotypes. It's going to leave them feeling icky, like you need to do something with that. And then not collecting data, because then you don't know how this is impacting the student learning. You don't know how it's impacting, your future preparation for classes. So those were like 2 slides I shared on pitfalls. And then the triumphs were really seeing those breakthrough points, really that they're moving into more confidence, deeper learning, those intercultural competency skills, where they start understanding that, cultural norms that people, even kids who are university or maybe even in their young 30s might still be living at home with their family, right? And why is that? Right? Because the economy is a different situation, because, it's a more collective community than it is individualist, like it is in the United States. They start to be able to tease out those individual anecdotes from wider cultural norms. And then, seeing them understand their own learning, where they go, oh, I learned this, or I feel more confident about this. And last time I wasn't able to speak in the past tense, but now I was, and they didn't have to ask me to repeat myself. So like my pronunciation has gotten better, my grammar's gotten better. So all of those things were helpful. So those things that I would tell people, and always insisting on the 3 conversations. Like you have to do a minimum of 3 if you want to see the benefit of that.
A lot of good stuff there, Daniel. What stood out to you?
There's a lot to unpack there. That's some great stuff. I think I noticed this like pendulum swing, right? Like at first, Patty's like, okay, I'm going to grade this way, and like super structured, and it failed. And then the pendulum swung the other way and was like, I'm going to be completely flexible. And it didn't work either. So, and I think that's kind of what we're looking for in the balance of assessing conversations or using TalkAbroad for assessment is what is the combination between the structure and the freedom? And how do we assess that? And how do we allow for structure and freedom together? So we know even from just like a conversation standpoint, like a conversation that's overly structured doesn't work well. And a conversation that's just completely free doesn't generally work well either. I mean, there are exceptions to both those rules, but generally it's that back and forth. And so if that's how we're thinking that conversations should be structured, I think that should actually like spill over into how they're assessed also. Like, what are the structured parts that we can look at, and what are the freedoms? And I think Patty brings up too, like, not just in terms, sometimes like assessment, it's not just the grades that go into the grade book, right? There's the student, their own assessment on their learning, looking at these perception studies, like their attitudes and motivation and how that changes. And there are these other things that sometimes in the languages we might focus more on like the actual language itself rather than some of these other bigger concepts and ideas. And I love how Patty talks about like some of the pitfalls. We're not addressing some of those like stereotypes that like, oh, I talked to somebody in Mexico and they said this, therefore everyone in Mexico believes this. And it's like, I don't want to like shortchange our students and say, well, that happens every time and that's their base level of thinking. But sometimes it does happen, right? Sometimes it's like, well, this is my knowledge on that country. This is my only interaction. And so, like, that's how our brains work. We generalize that information broader until we get more information that changes that. But really using that at the beginning in terms of assessment. So I think there are lots of different ways that we can assess learning and the different types of learning and how you use that. So I think, yeah, I think we can all learn a lot from Patty there. Just kind of what worked and what didn't work and the evolution of using this. I think part of it, don't be afraid to try it. And that's maybe me. Like,
or you can try different things, like Patty did here, right? This worked for my students, but in different classes, we might find that different types of assessment work a lot better, work a lot worse. I'll again point listeners here to sampling versus different professor views on this from the videos that are available on our YouTube channel and through the professor dashboard, because assessment is one of these where it varies a lot. And we could take a kind of a meta summary of our conversation here and say, yes, there are some trends, there are some patterns, and Patty is right in the middle of this, right? She emphasizes the preparation ahead of time. She does a pass-fail for the actual conversation, which I think is very, very common. And then 3, she critically grades the reflection that they're doing afterwards. And number 4, one of the things that stood out to me from Patty is she's really looking for those students to see their own learning journey, right? So using assessment, not just for that final grade, but so that the student is participating in seeing their progress and reflecting on that progress. And assessment is an important part of that because students want that external validation, right? That yes, they struggled on the first one and by the last one, they're getting A's or whatever it is, it can be very helpful.
Yeah, and we've talked about this a lot before, like language learning or acquisition, however you want to talk about it, is generally a daunting, immeasurable task. Like in the beginning, like the first few weeks, like, yes, I learned 10 words and it's great. And we talked about that like inverted funnel, but like as I progress and become more advanced, like it just becomes more vast and more nebulous. And like assessment's really important because it gives you some like measurable steps and outcomes. And I think for students especially, like this is how I felt and what I could do at the beginning of the semester, and this is what I can do at the end. It's huge, huge.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap up on that. And again, make a quick mention of the different areas where you can get some more contextualized advice or help as you're trying to think through what assessment will look like for your given student population and your given textbook or curriculum. We've got videos from a number of different professors explaining all of this that will be a deep rabbit hole that you can jump into and learn. If any of those professors particularly hit what you're thinking about, then reach out to us, because all of those professors have volunteered to mentor new professors as they're trying to implement TalkAbroad in their curriculum and are thinking through some of that assessment. So don't hesitate to take advantage of that. And finally, we have some free consulting. So if you have a very specific curriculum, you want to meet with a curriculum designer who has experience and can discuss with you what might or might not work very well in your curriculum, we can schedule a time to meet and actually dive more deeply into that within your given context. So that wraps us up. Daniel, any last thoughts on assessment? You're done.
I'm done. We're going to have to go through and assess all of these later. No, I think, again, like, don't be afraid to try it. I mean, sometimes assessment just seems like so, and obviously it's important, right? And we have different contexts, but like, being able to play with that and being open with students as you do that, I think is super, super important. And together, I think you can kind of craft something that really fits your specific context. I think that's where you'll get the most out of this, is when it really maps onto exactly what you're doing and how you do things.
Perfect. Thanks for joining, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Todd.
Hi, and welcome to TalkAbroad. TalkAbroad is a worldwide community that supports students during their language learning journey by providing authentic one-on-one conversations with trained native speakers. In this video, we're going to walk through the process of setting up your class for the semester. Let's dive in. Go ahead and log in to your TalkAbroad account. If you don't yet have an account, you can create one from our homepage, talkabroad.com. On your professor homepage, you'll see the steps to get started. We're going to create a section for each class you are teaching, populate those sections with assignments, and then provide the necessary instructions to your students. Let's add a new section. After saving your new section, you'll notice a section code has been created that begins with the first 5 letters of your last name. You'll need to provide this code to your students to allow them to register. When viewing your section, the column on the left will be populated with your students as they register. When you click on a student name, you'll see the conversation details and be able to access the audio recording. The column on the right contains your assignments. Assignments are your way of communicating with the conversation partner. Make a special note of the box labeled Topic for the Conversation. Usually 5 to 6 sentences in the target language describing the topic works really well. Create a separate assignment for each conversation your students will complete. As you know, our conversation partners are not tutors and will not be providing explicit feedback or any teaching. Feel free to reach out to your main contact at TalkAbroad for help creating assignments or to schedule a free session with a curriculum consultant. Before we end, let's quickly review the 2 things your students will need in order to get started. 1. They'll need the section code located on your professor homepage in order to register. 2. They'll need a link to the TalkAbroad student instructional video and instruction manual. With those 2 things, your students will have everything they need to register, purchase credits, and complete their TalkAbroad conversations. If they have any questions along the way, you can direct them to the support button on every TalkAbroad page. there will almost always be a live person they can chat with to get their questions answered. We want you to be able to focus on teaching. Leave all of the support to us. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us in this training session. We encourage you to explore all the resources available to professors, including our TalkAbroad sequences. Sequences are ready-to-use conversation topics in a sequence that includes preparation and reflection activities. They include both a professor manual and a student workbook. And don't forget, we're here to help. If you need anything, we're just a few clicks away by chatting with us on the website or emailing your main contact. Enjoy your semester with TalkAbroad. We look forward to hearing how it goes.
¿Cómo es Buenos Aires, la naturale y...
Bueno, mi ciudad no es muy natural, es la capital de Argentina, entonces hay muchas construcciones y hay muchos árboles, eso sí, hay muchos árboles, hay como leyes, es una regla que tiene que haber muchos árboles o un árbol cada 5 metros, creo, entonces hay muchos árboles y también hay parques y lagunas también. Tenemos una reserva ecológica que también es bastante grande, pero no mucho más. Es como plano y sí, es húmedo, hace frío y calor, no, pero no extremos. No tenemos mucho frío y el calor sí, tenemos mucho calor. En verano es imposible, sí. ¿Y tú cómo es en tu ciudad?
Sí, es similar con Florida. Florida es plano, pero me gusta el océano, es cerca de mi apartamento. Pero originalmente soy de Colorado.
Sí.
Extraño las montañas. Pero Florida es muy bonita. Hay muchos árboles y los parques. Es bien. Hay mucho
Sí.
calor.
¿Y el clima? Hay mucho calor, sí. ¿Todo el año o en invierno hace frío en algún momento o no? Todo el año hace calor.
Todo hace calor.
Wow. Sí.
El invierno en Colorado, pero Florida hace calor todos los días.
Sí. Y en Colorado hay mucha nieve, ¿no? ¿En invierno o sí?
Sí, sí.
Bien.
Yes. Es muy bonita para la Navidad. Es mi favorita.
¿Qué actividades te gusta hacer al aire libre? ¿Qué te gusta hacer?
Sí, después de la cuarentena, antes de, me gusta ir al cine y caminar en los parques y montar mi bicicleta cerca de o en los parques también y nadar en el océano.